Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. The year was 2018, and I found myself working the night shift as a security guard at a secluded research station nestled in the shadow of Mount Rainier, Washington. The facility wasn't anything like the high-tech outposts you'd see in science fiction movies. Instead of hunting aliens or creating superweapons, the scientists here were dedicated to studying climate change, geological phenomena, and the unique ecosystem of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Samuel Red Cloud. I grew up on the Nisqually Reservation, not far from where I now stood watch over a collection of squat, utilitarian buildings and their inhabitants. After high school, I'd enlisted in the Army, did 2 tours in Afghanistan, and when I got out, I drifted into security work. The pay was decent, and I figured keeping an eye on a bunch of scientists couldn't be that difficult. Plus, being close to home meant I could visit my aging parents on my days off. It was late September when I started the job. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of the coming winter. The research station, officially named the Mount Rainier Environmental Research Center, MRERC, was a collection of prefab buildings, laboratories, and storage facilities spread out over about 10 acres. The whole place was surrounded by dense forest, with the looming presence of Mount Rainier always visible on clear days. Dr. Elena Kostova, the head of the facility, gave me a tour on my first day. She was a tall, imposing woman with sharp green eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. Her salt and pepper hair was always pulled back in a tight bun, and she moved with the purposeful stride of someone who always had somewhere important to be. "Mr. Red Cloud," she said, her slight Eastern European accent adding a crisp edge to her words. "I cannot stress enough the importance of security here. Our work is sensitive, not because it's classified, but because it's vital. Climate change deniers would love nothing more than to discredit our research or steal our data to twist it to their own ends." I nodded, taking in the layout of the place. There were 5 main buildings: the administration building, which housed offices and a small cafeteria, 2 laboratory buildings, a dormitory for the resident scientists, and a large storage facility. Scattered around these were smaller outbuildings and sheds used for equipment storage and miscellaneous purposes. "Your primary duties will be to monitor the security cameras, conduct regular patrols, and ensure all buildings are secure," Dr. Kostova continued. "We've had issues with local wildlife getting too close to the buildings, so you'll need to keep an eye out for that as well. Any questions?" I shook my head. It seemed straightforward enough. "No, ma'am, I think I've got it covered." She gave me a tight smile. "Good. Welcome aboard, Mr. Red Cloud. I hope you'll find your time here uneventful." Little did I know how wrong she would be. For the first few weeks, the job was exactly as I expected. My shift started at 8 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. I'd arrive as the sun was setting, relieving the day shift guard, a friendly older guy named Frank who always had a joke or a bit of gossip to share. "Watch out for Dr. Patel and Dr. Chen," he'd say with a wink. "Caught them sneaking into the storage shed last week. Seems like they're doing some extra research, if you know what I mean." I'd laugh and shake my head. The soap opera of scientist relationships wasn't really my concern, but it was amusing to hear about. Most nights followed a simple pattern. I'd start with a perimeter check, making sure all the gates were locked and the fence was intact. Then I'd settle into the small security office, a room barely bigger than a closet, crammed with monitors showing feeds from the various security cameras around the facility. Every couple of hours I'd do another walkthrough, checking each building. The scientists mostly kept to themselves at night. Occasionally I'd see a light on in one of the labs, some dedicated researcher burning the midnight oil, but for the most part the place was quiet. The only real excitement came from the local wildlife. Mount Rainier National Park was home to a diverse array of animals, and some of them occasionally got a little too curious about our facility. I'd had to shoo away raccoons digging through trash, scare off a young black bear that was sniffing around the cafeteria's back door, and once, memorably, had to call in animal control to deal with a confused elk that had somehow managed to get itself trapped in the space between 2 of the buildings. But as September turned to October, and the nights grew longer and colder, I started to notice something off. It was nothing I could put my finger on at first. Just a feeling, a prickling at the back of my neck when I was doing my rounds, like I was being watched. I tried to shrug it off. After all, we were in the middle of the wilderness. Of course, there were eyes out there in the dark. Owls, coyotes, maybe even a cougar or two. But this felt different, more intentional. I mentioned it to Frank one morning as I was finishing up my shift. "Ah, that's just the mountain playing tricks on you," he said with a laugh. "This place can mess with your head if you let it. All that isolation, you know? Start seeing things that aren't there." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness, both growing up and during my military service, to know the difference between normal forest sounds and something out of place. And something out there was definitely out of place. As October wore on, the feeling only intensified. I started noticing small things, scratches on the outside of buildings that hadn't been there before, strange tracks in the mud that I couldn't identify, and once, a smell so foul it made me gag, like rotting meat and wet dog combined. I brought it up to Dr. Kostova, but she dismissed my concerns. "Mr. Red Cloud, we're in the middle of a national park. Of course there are animals around. That's part of why we're here, to study this ecosystem. Unless you see something actually threatening the security of this facility, I suggest you focus on your assigned duties." Her words stung, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I started paying more attention during my rounds, looking for anything out of the ordinary. I even started bringing my personal camera, an old digital SLR I'd bought years ago but rarely used, hoping to capture evidence of whatever was out there. For weeks, nothing changed. The nights grew colder, and the first dusting of snow fell on the higher elevations of Mount Rainier. The research station settled into a quiet routine, with most of the scientists focused on analyzing the data they'd collected over the summer months. And then, on a crisp night in late October, everything changed. It was about 2 a.m. and I was doing my usual rounds. The night was clear and cold, with a nearly full moon casting everything in a pale, silvery light. The air was so still I could hear the crunch of frost under my boots as I walked. I'd just finished checking the main laboratory building when I noticed something odd. The door to one of the storage sheds, the one we used for old equipment and supplies, was slightly ajar. I frowned. I was sure I'd locked it earlier in the evening. Maybe one of the scientists needed something, I muttered to myself, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't likely. Most of the researchers were sound asleep at this hour, and anyone working late would have been in the main lab, not out here. I approached the shed cautiously, one hand on the flashlight at my belt, the other hovering near the holster of my sidearm. As I got closer, I could see that the door wasn't just ajar, it had been forced open. The lock was hanging, twisted and broken from the latch. My heart started to pound. This wasn't just carelessness or a forgetful scientist. Something was very wrong here. I unholstered my weapon and clicked on my flashlight. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone in there?" No response. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The beam of my flashlight swept across the interior of the shed, and I felt my blood run cold. The place was a disaster. Shelves had been overturned, their contents scattered across the floor. Boxes were torn open, their contents strewn about. And there on the concrete floor was a dark, wet stain that I knew instinctively was blood. "Oh shit," I breathed. I keyed my radio. "This is Red Cloud. We have a situation at Storage Shed 3. Possible break-in and injury. Requesting immediate backup." The radio crackled to life. "Copy that, Red Cloud. What's your status?" "I'm secure for now, but there's blood. A lot of it. I think someone might be hurt." "Understood. Stay put. I'm waking Dr. Kostova and calling the police. Do not engage if you see anyone suspicious. Over." I acknowledged the order, but something kept me moving. The blood trail led out the back door of the shed, into the dark forest beyond the perimeter fence. Someone was out there, possibly injured, possibly dying. I couldn't just stand here and wait. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail. The moonlight was just bright enough for me to make out dark splotches on the fallen leaves and pine needles. Whatever or whoever was bleeding, they were losing a lot of blood. I'd gone about 100 yards into the forest when I heard it. A low guttural sound somewhere between a growl and a moan. It came from up ahead, beyond a small rise. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to wait for backup, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone might be hurt, might need my help. I crept forward, moving as quietly as I could. As I reached the top of the rise, I saw it. In a small clearing below, illuminated by the moonlight, was something. At first my mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was large, larger than a bear, with matted fur that seemed to shift and change color in the moonlight. Its limbs were long, too long, ending in wickedly curved claws. And its face. God, its face. It was like a wolf's muzzle, but elongated, with teeth that gleamed unnaturally in the moonlight. Crouched beside it was the broken body of one of our researchers, Dr. Sarah Chen. The young geologist's lab coat was stained dark with blood, her eyes open and glassy. I felt bile rise in my throat. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare. But the coppery smell of blood on the night air told me this was all too real. The creature, I couldn't think of it as an animal. It was too wrong for that, was hunched over Dr. Chen's body. As I watched, frozen in horror, it raised its head and sniffed the air. Then slowly it turned to look directly at me. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural yellowish light. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something that should not exist. Something that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. For a heartbeat we stared at each other. Then, with a roar that shook the very air around us, the creature charged. Time seemed to slow down. I could see every detail of the monster as it bounded towards me. The way its muscles rippled under its bizarre, shifting fur, the gleam of saliva on its impossibly long teeth, the unnatural yellow glow of its eyes. Training kicked in. Without conscious thought, I raised my sidearm and fired. The sound was deafening in the quiet of the forest, and I saw the creature stumble as the bullet hit its shoulder. But it didn't go down. If anything, the shot only seemed to enrage it further. I fired again and again, emptying my magazine into the charging beast. Each shot hit, I was sure of it, but the creature kept coming. It was as if bullets meant nothing to it. With a sinking feeling in my gut, I realized my weapon was useless. There was only one option left: run. I turned and sprinted back the way I had come, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. Behind me, I could hear the monster's ragged breathing and the sound of branches snapping under its weight. My lungs burned as I ran, fear giving me speed I didn't know I possessed. But I could hear the creature gaining on me. Its hot, fetid breath seemed to be right at my neck. Up ahead, I saw a drop-off. In the moonlight, I could make out the glint of water below, the Nisqually River. It was a long drop, and the river was known for its fierce current, especially this time of year when it was swollen with rainwater and early snowmelt. But it was my only chance. Without slowing down, I launched myself off the edge of the cliff. For a moment I was airborne, the cold night air whipping past me. Then I hit the water with a shock that drove the air from my lungs. The current immediately caught me, tumbling me over and over. I fought to the surface, gasping for air. The water was brutally cold, numbing my limbs almost instantly. But cold was better than dead, so I let the current carry me downstream, away from the monster on the cliff. I don't know how long I was in the river. Time lost all meaning as I struggled to keep my head above water, occasionally being pulled under by the fierce current. My body was battered against rocks, my clothes torn by branches reaching out from the riverbank. Eventually, the river widened and the current slowed. With the last of my strength, I managed to drag myself onto a rocky beach. I lay there, shivering uncontrollably, my body one massive ache. As the adrenaline faded, the pain set in. My leg was definitely broken. I could feel the grinding of bone when I tried to move it. My ribs ached with every breath, and I was pretty sure at least a couple were cracked, if not outright broken. But I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived. As consciousness began to fade, I heard the distant sound of voices and saw the bobbing lights of flashlights. Search and rescue, I thought dimly. Someone had raised the alarm. Then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed, the steady beep of a heart monitor filling my ears. For a moment I was disoriented, unsure of where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then the memories came flooding back. The storage shed, the creature, the desperate flight through the forest and down the river. I tried to sit up, but a wave of pain washed over me, forcing me back down onto the bed. A nurse must have noticed I was awake because suddenly there was a flurry of activity around me. Doctors were called, vitals were checked, and I was peppered with questions about how I was feeling. It wasn't until several hours later, after I'd been poked, prodded, and dosed with painkillers, that I got any answers of my own. Dr. Kostova came to see me, her usual stern expression tinged with what looked like genuine concern. "Mr. Red Cloud," she said, pulling up a chair next to my bed, "I'm glad to see you're awake. You gave us quite a scare." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw. Dr. Kostova handed me a cup of water, which I sipped gratefully. "What happened?" I finally managed to croak out. Dr. Kostova's expression tightened. "We were hoping you could tell us. When you radioed in about a disturbance at the storage shed, we called the police. But by the time they arrived, you were gone. We found signs of a break-in at the shed and—" She paused, her voice catching slightly. "And we found Dr. Chen's body in the woods." I closed my eyes, the image of Sarah Chen's broken body flashing through my mind. "The creature," I said. "Did they find it?" Dr. Kostova's brow furrowed. "Creature? Mr. Red Cloud, the police believe this was a bear attack. A large one, admittedly, but it wasn't a bear," I interrupted, my voice stronger now. "What I saw, it wasn't anything natural. It was too big, too wrong. It walked on two legs, had claws like knives, and its face—" I shuddered at the memory. Dr. Kostova's expression was a mixture of concern and skepticism. "Mr. Red Cloud, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for the mind to embellish memories in times of extreme stress." I shook my head, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "I know what I saw, Dr. Kostova. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't my imagination." She sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "The police found no evidence of any creature matching your description. They did find tracks consistent with a large bear, and the wounds on Dr. Chen's body are consistent with a bear attack." I wanted to argue further, but I could see it was pointless. They had already made up their minds about what had happened. And really, could I blame them? If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. "What happens now?" I asked instead. "You focus on recovering," Dr. Kostova said, her tone softening slightly. "The doctors say you have a broken leg, 3 cracked ribs, and a mild concussion, not to mention hypothermia and numerous cuts and bruises. You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Red Cloud." I nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling over me. "And the research station?" "We're temporarily suspending operations while the police complete their investigation. Once they give us the all-clear, we'll resume our work." She stood up, smoothing down her jacket. "Get some rest, Mr. Red Cloud. We'll talk more once you're feeling better." As she left, I sank back into the pillows, my mind whirling. I knew what I had seen, regardless of what anyone else believed. And I had a sinking feeling that this was far from over. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hospital rooms, physical therapy sessions, and police interviews. I told my story over and over to detectives, to park rangers, even to a psychiatrist they brought in to evaluate my mental state. Each time I could see the disbelief in their eyes, the way they exchanged glances when I described the creature. No one believed me. Not really. They nodded and took notes, but I could tell they had already decided I was either confused, hallucinating, or outright lying. The official report listed the incident as a bear attack, with my unusual account attributed to the trauma of the event and the effects of hypothermia. Dr. Chen's death was ruled an animal attack, her body too damaged for a more specific determination. The research station was cleared to resume operations after a thorough investigation found no evidence of foul play or ongoing danger. As for me, I was placed on extended medical leave. My broken leg was set, my ribs slowly healed, and the cuts and bruises faded. But the memory of that night remained as vivid as ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that by dismissing my account, the authorities were leaving everyone at the research station in danger. Whatever that creature was, it was still out there, and who knew when it might attack again. It was during my 3rd week in the hospital that I had an unexpected visitor. Frank, the day shift guard, came to see me, his usually jovial face creased with worry. "How you holding up, kid?" he asked, settling into the chair by my bed. I shrugged, wincing slightly at the movement. "Been better. You?" Frank sighed, rubbing a hand over his balding head. "Look, I owe you an apology. Remember when you told me about feeling like something was watching you? I brushed it off. Told you it was just the mountain playing tricks." I nodded, not sure where he was going with this. "Well," Frank continued, lowering his voice, "I've been doing some digging. Turns out you're not the first person to report seeing something unusual in those woods." That got my attention. I leaned forward, ignoring the twinge in my ribs. "What do you mean?" Frank glanced towards the door as if checking we were alone. "There have been stories for years, mostly from hikers or campers, a few from locals. Talk of something big in the forests around Rainier, something that ain't no bear or mountain lion." "Why hasn't anyone investigated?" I asked, feeling a mix of vindication and frustration. Frank shrugged. "Most folks write it off as campfire stories or overactive imaginations. The few official reports get buried or explained away. But after what happened to you and Dr. Chen, I'm not so sure anymore." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I made some calls, talked to some old-timers who know the area, got a list of similar incidents going back decades. Thought you might want to take a look." I took the paper with shaking hands. "Thanks, Frank. This means a lot." He stood up, patting me awkwardly on the shoulder. "Just be careful, kid. Whatever's out there, it's dangerous, and there are people who don't want this story getting out." As Frank left, I unfolded the paper and began to read. With each account, each sighting, each mysterious disappearance, I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever I had encountered that night, it wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something bigger, something darker, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. As soon as I was released from the hospital, I threw myself into researching the incidents Frank had shared with me. My leg was still in a cast, and my ribs ached with every breath, but I couldn't just sit idle, not when I knew there was something dangerous out there, something that the authorities were either ignoring or covering up. I started by digging into local history. The Nisqually and other local tribes had lived in the shadow of Mount Rainier for thousands of years. Surely if there was something unusual in these forests, they would have stories about it. It took some doing. Many tribal elders were understandably wary of outsiders asking questions about their legends, but eventually I made contact with an elderly Nisqually man named Joseph Swiftwater. He agreed to meet me at a small diner in Eatonville, a town just outside the national park. Joseph was in his 80s, his face deeply lined, but his dark eyes were sharp and alert. He listened patiently as I recounted my experience, nodding occasionally but saying nothing until I finished. "What you saw," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "We have a name for it in our language. Roughly translated, it means the one who walks between." "Between what?" I asked, leaning forward. Joseph's eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of something, fear, respect, in their depths. "Between worlds," he said simply. "Between what is and what should not be." He went on to tell me stories that had been passed down through generations. Tales of a creature that was neither fully animal nor fully spirit, that could appear and disappear at will, that hunted not just for food, but for the pleasure of the kill. "Our ancestors knew to avoid certain parts of the mountain," Joseph said. "Places where the veil between worlds is thin. But now, with so many people in the park, with your research stations and your cameras, you're disturbing places that should be left alone." I left my meeting with Joseph with more questions than answers, but also with a growing sense of unease. If these legends had any basis in fact, and after what I'd seen, I was inclined to believe they did, then the danger was far greater than anyone realized. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research. I pored over old newspaper archives, looking for reports of unusual animal attacks or disappearances in the Mount Rainier area. I reached out to cryptozoology forums online, sifting through the obviously fake stories for accounts that matched what I had seen. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Every few years, there would be a cluster of sightings or unexplained incidents. They never made major news: a hiker going missing here, unusual animal attacks there. But when you looked at them all together, it painted a disturbing picture, and the most recent cluster seemed to be centered around the Mount Rainier Environmental Research Center. I knew I needed to go back. Whatever this creature was, it was drawn to the research station for some reason, and if I was going to stop it, to prevent more deaths like Dr. Chen's, I needed to figure out why. But as I dug deeper, I began to feel like I was being watched. Cars would linger a bit too long outside my apartment. I'd catch glimpses of unfamiliar faces in crowds, only to have them disappear when I looked again. Someone didn't want me looking into this, but who and why? The answers, I was becoming increasingly convinced, lay back at Mount Rainier, back where this all began. It was time to return to the mountain. It took some doing, but I finally managed to convince Dr. Kostova to let me return to the research station. I told her I needed closure, that returning to the scene might help me process the trauma of what had happened. I didn't mention my suspicions or the research I'd been doing. Something told me that would be a quick way to get myself barred from the facility permanently. As I drove up the winding road to the research station, I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. The familiar silhouette of Mount Rainier loomed ahead, its snow-capped peak gleaming in the late afternoon sun. It looked peaceful, majestic even. Hard to believe it could be harboring something as terrifying as what I'd encountered. Dr. Kostova met me at the main gate. She looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than I remembered. "Mr. Red Cloud," she said, her tone formal. "Welcome back. I hope you understand that this is highly irregular." I nodded. "I appreciate you allowing me to come. I need to see it again, to understand." She studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "Very well, but please, try not to disturb the researchers. We're in the middle of some delicate experiments." As we walked through the facility, I noticed subtle changes. Security had been beefed up, with new cameras and sensor arrays visible at key points. The researchers we passed gave me curious looks, conversations dropping to whispers as we went by. "We've implemented some new safety protocols," Dr. Kostova explained, noticing my attention on the security measures. "After what happened, well, we can't be too careful." I wondered if she really believed a few cameras would stop the creature I'd seen, but I kept that thought to myself. She showed me to a small room in the administration building. "You can use this as a base during your stay. I'm afraid we can't offer you your old position back, but you're welcome to observe our operations within reason." I thanked her, dropping my bag on the small cot. "Dr. Kostova," I said as she turned to leave, "has there been any unusual activity since that night?" She paused, her hand on the doorframe. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something, fear, uncertainty, cross her face. But when she turned back to me, her expression was neutral. "Nothing out of the ordinary, Mr. Redclad. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to attend to." As she left, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling me everything, but that was okay. I hadn't come here for her approval or her help. I was here to find answers, and to stop whatever was out there before it could kill again. That night, as the research station settled into its evening routine, I prepared for my own investigation. I'd brought night vision goggles, a high-powered flashlight, and a digital camera with an infrared sensor, and against my better judgment, I'd also brought a gun, a Glock 19 I'd purchased after leaving the hospital. I knew from experience that it might not stop the creature, but its weight on my hip was reassuring nonetheless. As I slipped out of my room and into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by the cameras or the night guards, but by something else. Something that was waiting, out there in the woods, for me to make my move. Little did I know, my return to Mount Rainier was about to set in motion a chain of events that would not only challenge everything I thought I knew about the world, but would also put me on a collision course with forces beyond my imagination. The hunt was on. But was I the hunter or the hunted? For the next few nights I settled into a routine. During the day I'd make a show of wandering the facility, chatting with researchers, ostensibly coming to terms with my trauma. But at night I'd slip out, using the skills I'd honed in the military to evade the security patrols. I focused my searches on the areas around where I'd first encountered the creature, and where Dr. Chen's body had been found. The police had long since concluded their investigation, but I hoped that with my specialized equipment, I might find something they'd missed. It was on the fourth night that I hit pay dirt. I was examining the area around the storage shed where it had all started, when my infrared camera picked up something odd. There was a faint heat signature coming from the ground, a few yards from the shed. It was barely perceptible, but it was there, a warm spot in the cool earth. Curious, I began to dig. The ground was surprisingly loose, as if it had been recently disturbed. About 2 feet down, my hand struck something solid. Brushing away the dirt, I found myself looking at a small metal box. My heart raced as I pried it open. Inside was a collection of papers, lab reports by the look of them, and a small leather-bound journal. But what really caught my eye was a small vial containing what looked like a tuft of fur. I was so engrossed in my find that I almost missed the sound of footsteps approaching. Quickly, I shoved everything back in the box and reburied it, making a mental note of its exact location. I just managed to straighten up when a beam of light hit me. Mr. Red Cloud? It was Dr. Kostova, looking surprised and more than a little suspicious. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" I forced a sheepish smile. "Couldn't sleep. Thought a walk might help. Old habits from my security days, I guess." She didn't look entirely convinced, but nodded. "Well, it's not safe to be out alone at night. Please return to your room." As I walked back to the main building, I could feel Dr. Kostova's eyes on me. I'd have to be more careful. But my mind was racing with questions. What was in those documents? And that fur, could it be from the creature? I knew I had to get back to that box to examine its contents properly, but I also knew that my window of opportunity was closing. Dr. Kostova's suspicions were aroused, and I doubted I'd have free reign of the facility for much longer. Back in my room, I tried to piece together what I knew. The creature, the hidden box, Dr. Kostova's evasiveness. It all pointed to something bigger than a simple animal attack. But what? What was the Mount Rainier Environmental Research Center really studying out here? As I lay in bed, sleep eluding me, a plan began to form. I needed to get back to that box, and I needed to do it soon. But more than that, I needed to find a way into the main research labs. Whatever answers I was looking for, I was becoming increasingly convinced they lay at the heart of the Emerarch's work. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow night, I'd make my move. Little did I know, forces were already in motion that would make my plan irrelevant, and put me on a collision course with the very thing I was hunting. The next day passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. I went through the motions of my recovery routine, all the while acutely aware of the increased scrutiny I was under. Dr. Kostova seemed to pop up everywhere I went, her sharp eyes following my every move. As night fell, I prepared for what I knew would be my last chance to uncover the truth. I waited until the midnight shift change, when I knew there would be a brief gap in the security patrols. Then, moving as silently as I could, I slipped out of my room and into the darkness. The night was overcast, the moon a faint glow behind thick clouds, perfect conditions for what I had planned. I made my way to the storage shed, my night vision goggles allowing me to move swiftly and surely through the gloom. I had just reached the spot where I'd found the buried box, when a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my hand instinctively going to the gun at my hip. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Red Cloud," came Dr. Kostova's voice from the darkness. She stepped into view, flanked by 2 security guards I didn't recognize. Both were armed and looked far more professional than the usual rent-a-cops employed by the facility. I froze, my mind racing. "Dr. Kostova, I can explain." She cut me off with a wave of her hand. "Save it. We both know why you're here." She nodded to one of the guards, who moved forward and expertly patted me down, removing my weapon. "Now," Dr. Kostova continued, "you're going to come with us. It's time we had a real conversation about what's going on here." I didn't see that I had much choice. Surrounded and outgunned, I allowed myself to be led back towards the main research building. But instead of going to Dr. Kostova's office or one of the meeting rooms, we descended into a sub-basement I hadn't even known existed. The elevator opened onto a stark, clinical hallway that wouldn't have looked out of place in a high-security government facility. "Welcome," Dr. Kostova said, a hint of irony in her voice, "to the real Mount Rainier Environmental Research Center." She led me to a large circular room dominated by banks of sophisticated-looking equipment and a massive central holographic display. But what caught my eye was a large, reinforced glass enclosure at the far end of the room. It was empty, but the claw marks scoring the inside of the glass told me all I needed to know about its intended occupant. "What is this place?" I asked, though I was starting to put the pieces together. Dr. Kostova sighed, suddenly looking very tired. This, Mr. Red Cloud, is where we study the anomaly. The creature you encountered, the one that killed Dr. Chen, it's not the only one of its kind, and it's not of this world. Over the next hour, Dr. Kostova laid out a story so fantastic, I would have dismissed it as fiction if I hadn't seen the creature with my own eyes. The Mount Rainier Environmental Research Center was a front, she explained. Its real purpose was to study and contain interdimensional incursions, places where the fabric of our reality wore thin, allowing things from other dimensions to cross over. We've known about these incursions for decades, Dr. Kostova said. They occur all over the world, but there's a particularly active zone here in the Mount Rainier area. Most of the time, the crossovers are minor strange energy readings, brief glimpses of landscapes that don't belong, but sometimes things come through, I finished for her. Things like what I saw. She nodded grimly. We call them threshold entities. They're not from our reality, and the laws of physics as we understand them don't fully apply to them. That's why your bullets were ineffective. My mind was reeling. But why keep this secret? Why not warn people? Dr. Kostova's laugh was bitter. Can you imagine the panic? The chaos? No, it was decided long ago that this had to be kept quiet. We contain what we can, cover up what we can't, and try to understand these incursions in hopes of one day preventing them entirely. I was about to respond when an alarm began blaring. The holographic display in the center of the room flared to life, showing a topographic map of the area with a pulsing red dot near the edge of the research center's perimeter. Speaking of incursions, Dr. Kostova said grimly, it looks like we have another one. The room erupted into activity. Researchers rushed to their stations calling out readings and coordinates. Through it all, I could feel a tension in the air, a sense of barely controlled panic. What do we do? I asked, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Dr. Kostova turned to me, her eyes searching my face. That depends, Mr. Red Cloud. You wanted answers. Well, now you have them. The question is, what are you going to do with them? I looked around the room, at the advanced technology, at the worried faces of the researchers. Then I looked back at Dr. Kostova. I want to help, I said firmly. Whatever's out there, whatever's coming through, I faced it before. I can do it again. A small smile, the first genuine one I'd seen from her, crossed Dr. Kostova's face. I was hoping you'd say that. She turned to one of the security guards. Get Mr. Red Cloud geared up. Looks like he's joining the containment team. As I was led away to be equipped for whatever we were about to face, I couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and exhilaration. I had come to Mount Rainier looking for answers, for closure. Instead, I had found a new purpose, a new battle to fight. Whatever was coming through that interdimensional rift, whatever horrors awaited us in the dark woods of Mount Rainier, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. I was quickly outfitted with a sleek black body armor that felt surprisingly light and flexible. One of the technicians handed me a weapon that looked like a cross between a rifle and something out of a sci-fi movie. Particle disruption gun, the tech explained briefly. Should be more effective against threshold entities than conventional weapons. Aim for center mass and hope for the best. Dr. Kostova approached, now wearing similar armor. The incursion is happening about 2 miles north of here, she said, her voice tense but controlled. We have a team en route, but we need to move fast. These events don't last long, and if we don't contain whatever comes through quickly. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The image of Dr. Chen's mangled body flashed through my mind, and I gave a grim nod. We piled into a rugged, all-terrain vehicle and sped off into the night. The forest blurred past us, the vehicle's advanced suspension handling the rough terrain with ease. As we neared the coordinates, I could feel a change in the air. It was subtle at first, a faint tingling on my skin, a slight pressure in my ears. But as we got closer, it intensified. We're nearing the threshold, Dr. Kostova said, her voice tight. Be ready for anything. We pulled up to a small clearing and quickly disembarked. The air here was wrong. It shimmered like a heat haze, but the night was cool. And there was a smell, acrid and alien, like ozone mixed with something I couldn't identify. Suddenly, the shimmering air in the center of the clearing began to twist and distort. It was as if reality itself was being warped, folded in on itself. A sound filled the air, Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between that set my teeth on edge. "Here it comes," Dr. Kostova said, raising her weapon. "Remember your training, people. Contain if possible, neutralize if necessary." The air split open like a wound in the fabric of reality. Through the tear I caught glimpses of a world that hurt my eyes to look at, impossible geometries, colors that shouldn't exist. And then something began to emerge. It wasn't the creature I had encountered before. This was something new, something even more alien. It moved like liquid smoke, its form constantly shifting and reforming. Multiple limbs, or were they tentacles, lashed out, testing the air of our world. "Open fire!" Dr. Kostova shouted, and the clearing erupted with the high-pitched whine of particle weapons. I raised my own gun and fired, watching in fascination as the beam struck the creature. Where it hit, the entity's form seemed to unravel, coming apart like mist in the wind. But for every part we destroyed, two more seemed to form. The creature, if you could call it that, began to advance. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it was still learning how to exist in our reality. One of the security team got too close, and a tendril of the entity whipped out, wrapping around his arm. The man's scream of agony was cut short as his arm simply ceased to exist, disintegrating into nothingness. "Fall back," Dr. Kostova yelled. "We need to regroup." As we retreated, laying down covering fire, I noticed something. The entity seemed to be having trouble maintaining its form. The longer it stayed in our world, the more it seemed to struggle. "Dr. Kostova," I called out, "I think it's unstable. It can't hold itself together in our reality." She nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Of course, the laws of physics here are anathema to its existence. We don't need to destroy it. We just need to hold it off long enough for our reality to do the job for us." With renewed determination, we formed a defensive line. Our weapons might not be destroying the entity, but they were disrupting it, making it harder for it to maintain cohesion. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we held our ground, firing continuously as the entity thrashed and writhed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it began to shrink. Its movements became more erratic, its form less defined. With a sound that could have been a scream of frustration or pain, if such concepts even applied to this being, it began to retreat back towards the rift it had emerged from. As suddenly as it had appeared, the entity was gone, slipping back through the tear in reality. The rift itself lasted only moments longer, sealing shut with a sound like thunder. For a long moment, nobody moved. The clearing was silent except for our heavy breathing and the faint sizzle of cooling weapon barrels. Is it over?" I finally asked. Dr. Kostova nodded slowly, her face pale but composed. "For now. But there will be others. There are always others." As we made our way back to the research center, my mind was whirling. I had just witnessed and helped fight something from another dimension. The world as I knew it had changed forever. But as I looked at the grim, determined faces of Dr. Kostova and her team, I realized something else. This wasn't a one-time event. This was an ongoing war, a secret battle to protect our reality from incursions we could barely understand. And now, for better or worse, I was part of it. In the days that followed the incursion, life at the Mount Rainier Environmental Research Center took on a surreal quality. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Researchers went about their daily routines, equipment hummed, and the majestic peak of Mount Rainier loomed unchanging in the distance. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, there was a constant undercurrent of tension. Everyone was on high alert, waiting for the next alarm, the next tear in reality. And me? I found myself in a state of limbo, caught between the world I had known and this new reality I had been thrust into. Dr. Kostova had given me a choice. Now that I knew the truth, I could leave, return to my old life with a generous severance package and an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Or I could stay, join their ranks officially, and become part of this secret war against interdimensional incursions. It wasn't an easy decision. Part of me wanted to run, to try and forget everything I had seen and return to a world where the laws of physics were immutable and monsters stayed firmly in the realm of fiction. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that entity emerging from the rift, saw the way reality itself seemed to recoil from its presence. And I thought of Dr. Chen, of the other victims whose deaths had been covered up or explained away. If I walked away now, wouldn't their deaths be in vain? A week after the incursion, I found myself standing in Dr. Kostova's office. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. "Have you made your decision, Mr. Red Cloud?" she asked, her tone neutral. I took a deep breath. "I have," I said. "I want to stay. I want to fight." The ghost of a smile crossed her face. "I'm glad to hear it. We need people like you, people who have seen what's out there and are still willing to stand against it." She stood, walking over to a safe embedded in the wall. From it, she withdrew a badge and a small device that looked like a heavily modified smartphone. "Welcome to the Threshold Containment and Research Division," she said, handing me the badge. "Officially, you'll be listed as a senior environmental analyst. The reality, as you know, is somewhat different." She held up the device. "This is your lifeline. It will alert you to incursions, provide real-time data during encounters, and allow you secure communication with the team. Guard it well." As I took the device, feeling its weight in my hand, the reality of my decision began to sink in. There was no going back now. I was committed to this new world of interdimensional threats and secret battles. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Dr. Kostova said, her expression turning grim, "you train. Because what you've seen so far, it's just the tip of the iceberg. The incursions are becoming more frequent, more violent. Something is changing on the other side of the threshold, and we need to be ready." As I left her office, my new badge heavy in my pocket and the device a constant reminder of my new reality, I couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and anticipation. I'd come to Mount Rainier seeking answers, seeking closure for what had happened that terrifying night months ago. Instead, I had found a new purpose, a new battle to fight. The world was bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. But now at least I was in a position to do something about it. As I looked out the window at the serene beauty of Mount Rainier, I made a silent vow. Whatever came through those rifts, whatever horrors the other dimensions might unleash, I would be there. Fighting not just for myself, not just for the oblivious public, but for the very fabric of our reality. The Night Watcher had become the Threshold Guardian, and the real battle was just beginning. Years have passed since that fateful night when I first encountered the creature in the woods of Mount Rainier. The world has changed in countless ways, yet for most people, life goes on as it always has. They wake up, go to work, live their lives, blissfully unaware of the battles being fought in the shadows to keep their reality intact. But for those of us in the Threshold Containment and Research Division, every day brings new challenges, new horrors, and sometimes new wonders. We've learned so much about the nature of reality, about the myriad dimensions that exist alongside our own. We've developed new technologies, new strategies to combat the incursions. Yet for every advance we make, the entities on the other side seem to adapt. The incursions grow more frequent, more varied. We've faced creatures that defy description, entities that can manipulate time and space, beings that can alter the very laws of physics around them. Dr. Kostova is gone now, lost during a particularly vicious incursion 3 years ago. Her sacrifice saved countless lives, but her loss is still keenly felt. I've stepped into her role, leading the team she built, carrying on her legacy. As I stand here now, looking out over the snow-capped peak of Mount Rainier, I can't help but reflect on the journey that brought me here. From a simple security guard to the leader of humanity's secret defense against interdimensional threats, it's a path I never could have imagined. The device in my pocket buzzes. Another alert, another potential incursion. I take a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever is to come. The fight goes on day after day, night after night. We are the unseen guardians, the threshold watchers, standing vigilant against threats most of humanity will never know existed. And as I turn away from the window, gathering my team for our next mission, I know one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever comes through that threshold, whatever horrors await us in the spaces between realities, will be there. Fighting, protecting, preserving the world we know and love. For in this vast, strange multiverse, our reality may be just one among countless others, but it's ours. And we'll defend it to our last breath. The night is falling, and somewhere out there a rift is opening. Time to go to work. The year was 2013, and I found myself standing in the dim back room of Marjorie's general store, the pungent smell of old leather and dust heavy in the air. This place, tucked amidst the rolling prairies of eastern Montana, was a lifeline to many of us scattered across the vast, open country. It was also a place where gossip and stories flowed as freely as the meager water supply that trickled through our parched land. "Name's Ethan Redwood," I told the stout woman behind the counter, my voice rough from disuse. "I'm looking for work, anything at all." Marjorie sized me up, her gaze lingering on my worn boots and faded jeans. The years hadn't been kind to me, and I knew it showed. "You any good with horses, Mr. Redwood?" "One of the best," I assured her, though it had been years since I'd sat in a saddle. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I needed this. I needed anything to get back on my feet. Life out here was tough, but it was home. She gave me a skeptical look, crow's feet crinkling at the corners of her eyes. "You a talker?" A ghost of a smile crossed my lips. I'd been known to spin a yarn or two. That did it. A flicker of amusement crossed her face. She scribbled an address on a crumpled receipt. "Head east towards the crazy mountains. There's a place about 30 miles out. Big old white ranch house with a red roof. Got a horse barn behind it. Named Samuel Hawthorne. Tell him Marjorie sent you." Samuel Hawthorne. If the gossip was to be believed, he was about as peculiar as a three-legged coyote. Lived alone, kept to himself, talked to the horses more than to people, some said. Perfect. I found the ranch as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. It was a sprawling affair, more land than any one man on his own would need. As I pulled my old truck up the gravel drive, I felt a prickle of unease. The horses, and there were dozens, grazed restlessly, their eyes wide and wary. Even the air seemed charged, heavy with an unspoken tension. The house loomed ahead, its white paint peeling in places, revealing the weathered wood beneath. Samuel Hawthorne stood on the porch, a silhouette against the fading light. He was tall, lean as a fence post, and even from a distance I could sense a raw energy radiating from him. "Mr. Hawthorne?" I approached him cautiously. "Marjorie at the general store sent me. I'm here about the work." He turned, his gaze cold and assessing. His face was deeply lined, testament to years spent under the harsh Montana sun. "Redwood, is it? Come on inside then." He didn't offer his hand to shake. The inside of the ranch house was as peculiar as its owner. Dusty taxidermy lined the walls, unseeing eyes staring out from the mounted heads of elk, deer, and animals I couldn't even name. The air hummed with a low, persistent buzz I couldn't place. Samuel pointed to a worn armchair and gestured for me to sit. He didn't beat around the bush. "Tell me, Redwood, you believe in things you can't see?" I shrugged, trying to keep my expression neutral. "The old stories? Some truth in them, I suppose. Spirits, maybe?" His eyes narrowed. "Not stories. Things out there in the darkness, things that don't follow the rules." He started to pace, his voice taut with nervous energy. "Something's been at my herd, killing horses not for food, for sport almost seems." He finally stopped, fixing me with a piercing stare. "The thing out there, it's not right. Not natural." My heart thudded in my chest. This was why folks kept their distance. Samuel Hawthorne wasn't just odd. He was touched, as the old-timers would say. "Look," I said cautiously, "whatever's bothering your horses, maybe it's a mountain lion. Maybe wolves got too bold. I'm a decent enough tracker, can help you find it, put it down." But he wasn't listening. His focus had shifted, his gaze fixated on a point over my shoulder. Following it, my blood ran cold. There, framed in the doorway leading to the kitchen, stood the largest, blackest wolf I'd ever seen. Its eyes burned like embers, and a low growl rumbled in its chest. But what froze me in place was the shape of it, the way it moved. Wrong, somehow. "You see it, don't you?" Samuel's voice was a hoarse whisper. "It's here. Right now." I nodded, unable to speak. Every instinct told me to run, but some deep, stubborn part of me, a part that echoed with the old stories of my ancestors, kept me rooted in place. The wolf thing took a step forward, its guttural growl escalating. It didn't move like an ordinary wolf, its limbs too long, its body contorted in impossible angles. Samuel reached under an end table, pulling out an old lever-action rifle. "Can you shoot?" His voice was eerily calm. "You bet," I said, my own voice steadier than I felt. "Then we might just survive the night," he said grimly, raising the rifle. "Thing is, bullets might not be enough." I took a steadying breath. I didn't know if I believed in monsters, but I believed in what I was seeing. And something told me this wouldn't be some simple hunt. The wolf thing snarled and lunged, a blur of darkness and teeth. Samuel fired, the sound deafening in the enclosed room. The creature staggered but didn't fall. It let out an unearthly howl, a sound that scratched at my sanity, and then it was upon us. The creature moved with impossible speed, dodging Samuel's frantic shots. It leapt onto the kitchen table, sending dishes crashing to the floor. I swung the rifle desperately, trying to get a clean shot, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling my nose. The room was a maelstrom, snapping teeth, flying fur, and the sickening copper scent of blood. Samuel stumbled, the wolf thing slashing at his legs. He cried out, the rifle clattering to the floor. It was on him in an instant, its weight crushing him. I charged forward, swinging my rifle like a club. I smashed it against the creature's ribs, felt the bone give, heard its howl cut short. It whirled, snapping at my face. I jumped back, barely avoiding its jaws as Samuel scrambled to his feet. "Ethan, behind the couch," he barked. I dove for cover just as the creature pounced, its claws ripping through the faded upholstery. We couldn't keep this up. It was too fast, too strong. "Samuel," I shouted, my voice catching in my throat. "This thing, it ain't like nothing I ever seen." He scrambled over to me, his face streaked with blood. "I know," he gasped, "but remember the stories? Remember what they used to call them?" My mind raced through the half-remembered tales my grandmother used to whisper. Stories of shadow things, monstrous creatures born of dark magic. "The Skinwalker," I breathed, the old Navajo name rising to my lips, a shiver running down my spine. Samuel nodded grimly. "They're real, and killable only by fire, so the stories say." My gaze snapped to the fireplace, an ember glowing dimly in the hearth. "But we ain't got matches." Samuel pulled a box from his pocket. "Old habit." He tossed me the matches and hefted the rifle. "Go for the fire, Ethan. I'll keep it busy." My heart hammered like it wanted to escape my chest, but I knew there was no other way. Each second counted. Samuel unleashed a shot and the creature snarled, its attention diverting for just a moment. I sprinted across the room, my boots slipping on the blood-stained tile. I fumbled with the matches, hands shaking. The fireplace seemed miles away. Behind me I heard Samuel grunt, the thud of bodies colliding with furniture. He wouldn't last long. I struck a match, the flame flickering weakly. I prayed to any spirits that might be listening as I lit the kindling. It caught with a whooshing sound, and I threw another match into the growing flames. Suddenly the creature was in front of me, its bloodshot eyes blazing. I scrambled backwards, fear seizing me. It lunged. I barely had time to raise an arm, and then I was engulfed in agonizing heat and blinding light. When I could see again, Samuel was beside me, pulling me to my feet. The creature thrashed in the heart of the fire, its unearthly howls echoing through the ransacked house. Flames devoured its inky fur, consuming its monstrous form until finally, mercifully, it stilled. We stood there, coughing and trembling as the flames died down, leaving nothing but ash in their wake. Samuel leaned heavily against the mantelpiece, surveying the damage. I didn't know what to say, my mind reeling. "Well," he coughed, "that's one way to get rid of a pest problem." There was a hint of grim humor in his voice, but it faded as he turned to me, his voice softening. "You all right, Ethan?" I took a shaky breath. "Think so. Reckon I owe you my life, and I owe you mine." He paused, looking around the devastated room. "Come daybreak, we'll clean this mess up, find new horses. This place won't hold ghosts for long." He patted my shoulder. "You've got the heart of a warrior, Ethan Redwood." I didn't feel like a warrior, but the adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. As we began the grim work of clearing the wreckage, I couldn't help but wonder what other shadows lurked in the vastness of the Montana wilderness. What other battles might lay in wait? The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with the promise of dawn as we stepped outside, the cool air soothing our battered skin. Samuel's horses stood trembling in a far corner of the pasture, and even in the dim light, there was a new alertness in their eyes. The night's horror slowly receded as we walked towards them. There was work to be done, a life to be rebuilt. I looked out at the sprawling land, this place that held both beauty and darkness, and a resolute strength rose within me. I was Ethan Redwood, and this was my home now. I'd faced the Skinwalker and lived to tell the tale, and whatever else came my way, I'd face that too. Little did I know, as I stood there in the growing light of a new day, that this was just the beginning of a journey that would take me deeper into the heart of Montana's mysteries and the shadows that lurked beneath its rugged beauty. In the days that followed, Samuel and I fell into an uneasy routine. We repaired the damage to the house, tended to the spooked horses, and tried to make sense of what had happened. But the memory of that night hung over us like a storm cloud, dark and heavy with the promise of more to come. It was on the third day, as we were mending a section of fence, that Samuel finally broke the silence that had grown between us. "You're not from around here, are you, Ethan?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the post he was hammering into the ground. I paused, wiping sweat from my brow. "No, sir, grew up in Arizona, Navajo Nation." He nodded as if confirming something he'd already guessed. "That explains a few things. You recognized what that thing was?" I shrugged, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "My grandmother used to tell stories. Didn't think they were real until you saw it with your own eyes," Samuel finished. He sighed, leaning on his hammer. "I've been out here for 30 years, Ethan. Seen things that would turn a man's hair white overnight, but nothing like that." "Why stay?" I asked, genuinely curious. "If it's so dangerous?" Samuel's gaze swept across the rolling prairie, the distant mountains purple against the horizon. "Because someone has to. This land, it's special, powerful, and power attracts things, dark things." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm Montana sun. "You saying there's more out there? More like that Skinwalker?" He nodded grimly. "Oh, there's more, much more, and they're getting bolder." I wanted to scoff, to dismiss his words as the ramblings of an old man who'd spent too much time alone. But the memory of that night was still too fresh, the scars on my arm a constant reminder of what we'd faced. "So what do we do?" I asked, surprised to hear the words coming from my own mouth. Samuel's weathered face broke into a small smile. "We? You planning on sticking around then?" I hadn't realized it until that moment, but yes, I was. Something about this place, about the battle we'd fought together, had awakened something in me, a sense of purpose I'd been lacking for far too long. "Guess I am," I said, matching his smile. "Good," Samuel nodded, "because I've got a feeling we're going to need all the help we can get." Over the next few weeks, Samuel began to teach me about the hidden world that existed alongside our own. We spent long evenings by the fire, him sharing tales of encounters with creatures I'd only heard about in my grandmother's stories. Thunderbirds that brought storms in their wake, water spirits that lured the unwary to watery graves, and worse things, nameless horrors that lurked in the shadows between worlds. But it wasn't all grim lessons and dire warnings. During the days we worked the ranch together, and I found myself rediscovering skills I thought I'd forgotten. The feel of a horse beneath me, the rhythm of the land, the satisfaction of a hard day's work, it all came flooding back. And then there were the neighbors, few and far between out here, but each with their own story to tell. There was old Mrs. Larson, who lived 10 miles to the north and swore she could predict the weather by the ache in her bones. Jack and Sarah Thompson, young newlyweds trying to make a go of it on a small cattle operation to the east, and Dr. Elena Rossi, the local veterinarian who seemed to know more about the area's mysteries than she let on. It was Elena who brought us our next brush with the supernatural. She arrived one evening just as the sun was setting, her old pickup kicking up a cloud of dust as it roared up the drive. "Samuel," she called, barely waiting for the engine to die before leaping out. "We've got trouble." Samuel and I exchanged a glance before hurrying to meet her. Elena's usually composed face was drawn with worry, her dark hair escaping from its usual neat bun. "What is it?" Samuel asked, his voice low and urgent. Elena's eyes darted between us, lingering on me for a moment before she spoke. "It's the Thompsons. They're cattle. Something's been at them, but it's not like anything I've ever seen before." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "Like our horses?" I asked, remembering the night of the Skinwalker attack. She shook her head. "No, this is different. The animals, they're changed, mutated almost. And Jack, he's..." She trailed off, her voice choked with emotion. Samuel put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Easy now. Tell us everything." As Elena recounted what she'd seen at the Thompson Ranch, I felt that same mix of fear and determination I'd experienced on the night of the Skinwalker attack. Whatever was out there, whatever was threatening our neighbors, we had to face it. Samuel must have sensed my resolve. He turned to me, his eyes glinting in the fading light. "You ready for this, Ethan? It's not too late to walk away." I thought of the life I'd left behind, the aimless wandering that had brought me to this place. Then I thought of the community here, of the land that needed protecting, of the purpose I'd found. "I'm ready," I said, squaring my shoulders. "Let's go." As we loaded up Samuel's old truck with an assortment of weapons and tools, both mundane and mystical, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. This was just the beginning, I realized, the start of a new chapter in my life, one filled with danger and mystery, but also with purpose and belonging. The Montana night stretched out before us, vast and full of secrets, and as we set out towards the Thompson Ranch, I knew that whatever we faced, we'd face it together. The drive to the Thompson Ranch was tense, the silence broken only by the rumble of the truck's engine and Elena's occasional directions. As we drew closer, an acrid smell began to permeate the air, growing stronger with each mile. "What is that?" I asked, wrinkling my nose. Samuel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Corruption," he said grimly, "the stench of something unnatural." As we crested a small hill, the Thompson Ranch came into view. Even in the gathering darkness, I could tell something was terribly wrong. The fields, which should have been filled with grazing cattle, were eerily empty. The farmhouse lights were on, but they flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the yard. We pulled up to the house, and the full extent of the situation became clear. The front door hung off its hinges, and deep gouges marred the wooden siding. It looked as if some massive beast had attempted to claw its way inside. "Jack? Sarah?" Elena called out as we approached the house, her voice tight with worry. A muffled sob answered her, and we rushed inside. The interior of the house was a disaster. Furniture overturned, pictures knocked from walls, and a pervasive smell of rot that made my stomach churn. We found Sarah Thompson huddled in a corner of the kitchen, her blonde hair matted with what looked like blood. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her clothes torn and dirty. Elena knelt beside her, speaking in soft, soothing tones as she checked for injuries. Samuel and I searched the rest of the house, but there was no sign of Jack. "Sarah," Samuel said gently, crouching down to her eye level, "can you tell us what happened? Where's Jack?" Sarah's gaze slowly focused on Samuel's face. "The cattle," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They changed. Jack went to check on them, and then..." She broke off, dissolving into tears. I felt a chill run down my spine. "We need to check the barn," I said to Samuel. He nodded grimly. "Elena, stay with Sarah. Ethan and I will investigate." As we stepped outside, Samuel handed me a shotgun from the truck. "Remember," he said, "whatever we find in there, it's not animal anymore. Don't hesitate." The barn loomed before us, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. As we drew closer, I could hear strange noises coming from inside, wet, squelching sounds interspersed with low, inhuman moans. Samuel pushed the barn door open, and the stench that hit us was overwhelming. I gagged, fighting the urge to vomit. In the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls, I could make out shapes moving in the shadows. They might have once been cattle, but now... "Dear God," Samuel breathed. The creatures before us were nightmarish amalgamations of flesh and bone. Extra limbs sprouted from twisted bodies. Eyes blinked from places where no eyes should be. And in the center of it all, half absorbed into the writhing mass of mutated flesh, was Jack Thompson. His eyes, still human and filled with pain, locked onto us. "Help! Me!" he managed to gasp. I raised my shotgun, but Samuel put a hand on my arm. "Wait," he said, his voice heavy. "There might still be a way to save him." From his pocket he pulled out a small leather pouch. "Old medicine," he explained, "might purge the corruption if we're not too late." What followed was the most harrowing night of my life. For hours, Samuel and I fought to separate Jack from the mutated mass of cattle, all while fending off attacks from the twisted creatures. We worked by the light of lanterns, the sounds of our struggle echoing through the barn. Samuel chanted in a language I didn't recognize, sprinkling the contents of his pouch over Jack and the mutated cattle. The air crackled with an energy I could feel but not see, and slowly, painfully, the flesh began to recede. As dawn broke, we finally managed to pull Jack free. He was alive but badly injured and in shock. The cattle, or what was left of them, lay still and silent in the barn. We emerged into the cool morning air, exhausted and covered in substances I didn't want to identify. Elena rushed to help us with Jack, her medical training kicking in as she assessed his injuries. Sarah stumbled out of the house, her face pale but composed. When she saw Jack, she let out a cry and ran to him, embracing him despite his condition. As Elena and Sarah tended to Jack, Samuel pulled me aside. "We need to burn the barn," he said quietly. "Everything inside has to go. Can't risk any of that corruption spreading." I nodded, too tired to argue even if I'd wanted to. We doused the barn in gasoline and set it alight, watching as the flames consumed the evidence of the night's horrors. As we stood there, the heat of the fire warming our faces, Samuel spoke. "You did good tonight, Ethan. Kept your head in a situation that would have sent most men running." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just did what needed doing." Samuel chuckled. "That's exactly my point. You're made for this life, whether you know it or not." As the barn collapsed in on itself, sending a shower of sparks into the morning sky, I realized he was right. Despite the terror, despite the danger, I felt more alive than I had in years. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. We helped the Thompsons clean up their property and deal with the loss of their livestock. Elena made frequent visits to check on Jack's recovery, which was slower than we'd hoped, but steady. Word of the incident spread quickly through the small community. Most dismissed it as a tragic accident, a fire that had claimed the Thompsons' cattle. But a few, those who had their own stories of strange occurrences, looked at Samuel and me with newfound respect. It was about a month after the Thompson incident that Samuel broached a subject I'd been half expecting, half dreading. "Ethan," he said one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the distant mountains, "I'm not getting any younger, and this land needs a protector." I knew where this was going, but I let him continue. "I've been thinking of taking on a partner, someone to share the work and the responsibility, someone who understands what we're really doing out here." He turned to look at me, his eyes serious. "What do you say? Want to make this arrangement permanent?" I thought about the life I'd left behind, the aimless wandering that had brought me to this place. I thought about the purpose I'd found here, the sense of belonging, and I thought about the shadows that lurked at the edges of this beautiful, dangerous land. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I'm in." Samuel grinned, looking years younger in that moment. "Good," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, "because I have a feeling things are just getting started." He was right, of course. The Thompson incident was just the beginning. Over the next few months, we faced a series of challenges that tested our resolve and pushed the boundaries of what I thought was possible. There was the case of the haunted silver mine, where we had to lay to rest the restless spirits of miners who had died in a cave-in nearly a century ago. We dealt with a nest of chupacabras that had been preying on local wildlife, their otherworldly shrieks echoing through the canyons as we hunted them down. We even had a run-in with a wendigo during a particularly harsh winter, the emaciated creature stalking the forests and leaving a trail of missing hikers in its wake. That encounter left both Samuel and me with scars, both physical and mental, that would take a long time to heal, but for every dark encounter, there were moments of light. I found myself growing closer to Elena, our shared experiences forging a bond that went beyond friendship. The community began to look to us as protectors, even if most didn't fully understand what they were being protected from. And always, there was the land itself, wild and beautiful, dangerous and nurturing all at once. I began to understand why Samuel had stayed all these years, why he felt so strongly about protecting this place. It was on a crisp autumn evening, about a year after I'd first arrived at Marjorie's general store looking for work, that Samuel and I sat on the porch, sharing a bottle of whiskey and watching the stars come out. "You know," Samuel said, his voice thoughtful, "when I first came out here I thought I was running away from something. Took me years to realize I was actually running towards something." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked. "Choosing this life?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "There are days," he admitted, "days when the weight of what we do, what we know, feels like too much. But then I look out at this land, think about the people we've helped, and I know I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." As if on cue, a lone wolf howled in the distance, its cry echoing across the prairie. But this time there was no fear, no tension, just the wild song of the Montana night. I raised my glass in a toast. "To where we're supposed to be," I said. Samuel clinked his glass against mine. "And to the shadows that brought us here." As we sat there, two guardians of a land both beautiful and perilous, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with dangers I could scarcely imagine, but I was no longer alone. I had found my place, my purpose. I was Ethan Redwood, protector of the Montana wilderness and all its secrets. And whatever the shadows might bring, I was ready to face them.